Welcome everyone to the Collectivize Facebook, a pre-trial panel. Thank you to Thierry van der Busche, Privacytopia, to the Computers, Privacy and Data Protection Conference for hosting us. For the technicians, for all of their work in the background, I'm hearing a lot of sounds coming from them right now, so I would really appreciate if that can somehow be turned off. My name is Jonas Staal. I'm an artist, and together with human rights lawyer Jan Fermon, I initiated the collective action lawsuit against Facebook. We launched it in March 2020. And today, during this online preliminary trial that I will be chairing, lawyer Jan Fermon will introduce of our indictment, which we will be in Geneva. And you will further be two expert witnesses that will testify possible common ownership over the Facebook platform if our lawsuit against Facebook would succeed. And this will be artificial intelligence researcher Sonia De Jager, director of privacy Mette Birkedal Bruun, and director of How Hebel am Ufer Theater in Berlin, Annemie Vanackere. In the meantime, if you have any questions, there is the live chat on the right side of your screen. So the core argument against Facebook is that its ownership model fundamentally infringes on the right to self-determination of peoples and individuals as enshrined in Article 1 of the United Nations Charter. And there are many examples to give when it comes to what that infringement looks like. The corporation instrumentalizes the users as neo-feudal data workers, extracting data as its primary income model. Facebook is used in surveillance capacities that infringe upon privacy and further impacts democratic elections in disproportionate ways. And of course, data captures and targeted campaigns of Cambridge Analytica have been a recent example. The corporation has willfully advised authoritarian regimes and entered into business deals with them, such as that of the Duterte regime in the Philippines. As a consequence, our indictment against Facebook demands that Facebook is to be recognized, first of all, as a public domain, and that its ownership to its approximately 2.5 billion active users. So our demand to collectivize Facebook is not meant to reform Facebook, neither do we want to nationalize Facebook. We want to transform Facebook and other trillion-dollar companies into transnational cooperatives, owned and governed by their users. Now, the dominant model of racial capitalism that structures our society, that structures our legal systems, is structured on the primacy of private property, and that might make our almost impossible. There are many historical examples of private initiatives that at some point affected the public to such an extent that it was deemed irresponsible to have them remain outside of democratic control and outside of democratic oversight. So if we think of 2008 financial crisis, banks were often temporarily, unfortunately, nationalized as their criminal dealing in credit derivatives ruined precarious classes around the world. Just this year, Spain temporarily nationalized private healthcare infrastructures in the coronavirus pandemic. At key moments in history, we have been able to collectively recognize a greater commons, even within a system that structurally aims to rob these commons from us. In the meantime, I'll to the technical team on the background. There's a lot of noise coming from you while I'm speaking. We appreciate if you can mute yourself. Thank you. And if we think about it further, many trillion-dollar companies even started out from public investment in the first place. Apple's innovations were unthinkable without public university research. Amazon have been without the publicly funded US postal system and transport infrastructure. Google does not create data, it capitalizes on the online data of others, just as our unpaid data labor provides the income revenue of Facebook. In other words, when we seriously consider our stakes in Facebook, in Amazon, in Alphabet that owns Google, in Apple, in Microsoft, Bayer that owns Monsanto, we can essentially conclude that they represent infrastructures that we have already paid for, that we already worked for. We made them in common, and now it's time that we own them in common. And in the process, let us not buy into the pseudo-benevolent rhetoric and so-called philanthropy, with which trillion-dollar companies tell us that they want to connect the world. In the coronavirus pandemic, we have seen how companies like Facebook and Amazon have capitalized on a global health crisis to increase the public's dependency on platforms, showing their best quarter numbers in a lifetime. Our crisis, demise, as it turns out, is their capital. Amazon CEO Jeff Bezos proposing to have his company help with vaccine distributions while his workers are dying in his gulag warehouses without protective gear, forced to pee in bottles so that they not miss their torturous target. It's like someone bombing your country and then offering to build a hospital in its ruins. And in that light, it's worth taking a long, hard look at the sponsors and partners of the CPDP conference. Facebook, Google, Uber, partnering on a team enforcing rights in a changing world. Well, it is these very same organizations that turn us into neo-feudal data workers, that ban workplace unionization, that ban the rights of workers to organize, that mine the fossil depths of this world for one more tablet, for one more fiber optic cable or data center to further precarize our lives. If we really want to enforce rights in a changing world, that begins with rejecting the transnational corporations are somehow driven by democratic benevolent impulses, and that they have any interests in reforming themselves. The time has come to say loud and clear, we paid for them, we worked for them, and now we must own them. Commonization, cooperatization, collectivization. These are the terms that mark the horizon of struggle for our commons. Therefore, lawyer Jan Fermon and I ask you, viewers and listeners, to join our lawsuit against Facebook by visiting collectivize.org. Here you will find the full indictment against Facebook. You can register as a co-claimant, meaning that when we file our indictment at the United Nations Human Rights Court, it will carry not just our names, but that of thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of others. We need to act as a collective to make a case for collectivization. So please join our collective action lawsuit at collectivize.org. Having made these introductory remarks, let us now begin the formal proceedings, starting with Jan Fermon, lawyer Jan Fermon, who will introduce the indictment. He's a lawyer at the Bar of Brussels in Belgium since 1989, specializes in criminal law, international humanitarian law, and human rights law. Since 2000, bureau member of the International Association of Democratic Lawyers, and he has represented trade unionists against attempts to criminalize collective actions, victims of the genocide in Rwanda, of war crimes committed by the US troops during the war on Iraq, and of NATO bombings in Libya. He was recently part of the legal team that successfully defended 41 Kurdish activists accused of participation in the Kurdistan Workers' Party, the so-called PKK, and he has defended victims Restos multinational eternity. With Pies Brakke published his book Political Defense in 2010. Jan Fermon has the floor for 20 minutes. Welcome, Jan.
Thank you, Jonas. Actually, you already went through the indictment at machine gun speed, and you raised already all the points I wanted to comment on. So, but I will get back to some of the questions you mentioned and discuss or present the indictment that we elaborated as the basis of the Collectivize Facebook project. The indictment actually, the starting point of the indictment is the idea or the situation, the changes in the world economy. In the beginning of the 20th century, finance monopoly capitalism developed. The financial sector, the banking sector, and other parts of the financial capital took control over the economic system because the individual capitalists, individual investors were not in a position anymore to raise the capitals that were necessary to actually develop the capitalist economy and develop the capitalist production. And the banking system actually somehow took over control over the economic development and also to some extent over other parts of the political and social system. Today, data are described as the new oil, and I think it could also be described, and maybe more accurately, as the new finance, the new financial system, because data play such an important role in the development of the economic system, and increasingly also of the political and social system, that those who control data, companies like Facebook, but also others, of course, Google and other players of this kind, gradually are putting the entire society under their control, economically, socially, politically. And so Jonas raised the question, what is the influence of this new development on the fundamental rights of the citizens throughout the world? Of course, a lot of discussion had already occurred on one aspect of it, which is the privacy aspect. That has been largely discussed. But we think that the development which I described a second ago has a much more far-going and profound influence than only the privacy question. In its introduction, Jonas already mentioned that, for example, it has a fundamental influence on labor rights. A new type of labor relations is emerging in this context. We all produce data through our daily activity on social media, on the internet. And that data actually is like some kind of new raw material that is then used by the rest of the economic system to perform all kinds of economic developments, or to trigger all kinds of economic developments. So actually, to some extent, we all became the coal miners of our economic system. We took the role of the coal miners in the 19th century, where the raw materials are now produced, but the raw materials are not produced by people who get a salary for this. The raw materials are produced by people who do actually work for free. So this development is, of course, not goes far beyond the mere privacy question, and is not only an individual matter, but it's privacy is essentially an individual question, a question of individual right. Here we get into a much more collective aspect of rights. It creates new labor relations which are not protected by the traditional labor rights. And we could even say that it creates some kind of new slavery, because the work is done for free, and the product or the result of the work is then appropriated privately by companies like Facebook. Of course, Facebook also has growing influence on public opinion, on social movements. It has a growing influence on surveillance by governments over individuals and over groups that are critical to government action. And it somehow has a paradox there, because it at the same time creates opportunities for communication for groups that are critical to governments. And at the same time, it is worrying that that possibility to communicate for those critical groups is then placed under the private control of a company, of the shareholders of a company, on which there is absolutely no democratic control and no possible grip from those social movements. Previously, when we were involved in social action, we could print leaflets, and that we could do it ourselves, and we could have our own distribution system of printed materials, leaflets, etc. Now that becomes much more, and it was difficult for governments to control every printing machine, every printing press, and every paper supply, although some governments tried it. Now, actually, it becomes much more easy because the access to the main platforms of exchange of information and the main platforms of communication is very, very strongly concentrated in the hands of a few. We try to reflect on Jonas and me, try to reflect on what kind of influence this development could have on global fundamental rights. And the way actually we did that was to simply go back to the International Bill of Human Rights, which is actually the combination of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights adopted by the United Nations and two more specific international legal instruments that elaborate further on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which are the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which were adopted in 1966 by the United Nations and which are ratified by almost all of the states in the world. And in their common Article 1, these two international covenants, it's the same text in the two covenants, define actually what I think is somehow the mother of all fundamental rights, and it's the right to self-determination. Very often when we mention the right to self-determination, people think about the right of secession of people, the right of people to create a state. But actually the right of self-determination is a much broader concept and a very interesting concept. And I would like to read out, and that's the only point I'm going to read out to you, I would like to read out the two first parts of those, of the common Article 1. It reads as follows. All people have the right of self-determination. By virtue of that right, they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. And point 2, all people may, for their own ends, freely dispose of their natural wealth and resources without prejudice to any obligations arising out of international economic cooperation based on the principle of mutual benefit and international law. In no case a people may be deprived of its own means of subsistence. That fundamental right actually is the basis for all the other fundamental rights. If you don't have control over your own life, if people don't have control over their destiny, if people don't control their natural resources, if people don't control their political and social and cultural institutions, then of course all the other fundamental rights become very formal and rather meaningless. Now, if we go back to that definition, we can see that the data company, the companies that control, private companies that control data, have actually a tremendous influence on each aspect of that right of self-determination. Freely pursue an economic development without having control over the new oil or the new finance is, of course, a complete illusion. If data plays such an important role in the whole economic development at this point, it's obvious that you can't control your economic, you can't really exert control over your economic development if you don't control data. The social development, of course, the social development is about interaction between actors in society. If that interaction is growingly controlled by companies like Facebook that control the platforms through which people interact, then of course there's no question it's impossible to have free determination of the cultural and social development. All people for their own ends may freely dispose of their natural wealth, but the most important natural wealth now seems to be increasingly data. So how can you freely dispose of your natural wealth, and derived from that, how can you freely develop a development policy? How can you freely exercise your right to development if you don't control the most important actual form of resource or natural wealth, which are data? And so we think we have to broaden the discussion about the fundamental rights from the mere question of privacy, which is of course important, and it's clear that it's a very worrying development. There are very worrying developments there, but we have to broaden it to all the rest and put it in a more global perspective, and that is actually what the indictment tries to do. Look at it from the point of view of the control of people over their fate, over the right to self-determination taken in that sense. As Jonas said, we believe that it is not sufficient to try to control those data companies. It's maybe even an illusion. Very often already in the past, states tried somehow to regulate multinational companies that were dominant in the old, in the previous type of capitalist economy. And we saw what happened. The banks in the financial sector, we saw it recently. Whatever rules were put forward, whatever frameworks were created to try to control those actors in the financial sector, those rules failed, or those initiatives or those attempts failed, because regulating in the margin, or attempting to regulate in the margin such important players, I think is in a globalized economy where these multinational actors simply escape national process of national regulation, or even multinational regulation in the sense of the EU. We think it's an illusion. There has been some talking recently about breaking up these companies, breaking up Facebook, and even governments and other players in the global economy have floated that idea to break up companies like Facebook, to create smaller entities, because the Facebook is too big to and is out of control because it's too big. But the experience with the finance sector shows that breaking up can temporarily bring some kind of or allow some kind of control. But these companies inevitably, in a system where they remain private, under private control, without any democratic overview, inevitably a new process of concentration always starts again and again. We therefore think that also that idea of breaking up such important players is insufficient or inefficient, actually. And that is why, and that's where the alliance between an artist and a lawyer, I think, is interesting, because it needs really some creative legal thinking. It needs creative debate, and of course, all the project of Jonas, all the artistic project of Jonas are precisely about creating such creative debate in society. It needs creative thinking and creative debate to find new legal forms which go beyond what is now known as well-established legal forms of property. But for example, it's not enough either to declare data an international common public good, because then the next question is, of course, how do you control that international common public good? For the same type of debate occurred now with the vaccine, with the question of the vaccine. And with the vaccine, maybe somehow you could say the World Health Organization, for example, as a multilateral body, could play a role in the administration of this common international public good. It's much more complicated, I think, with data. And we think, therefore, that the only workable idea, although it seems very utopic at this point, but the only workable idea in the mid-term run and in the long run is actually to collectivize Facebook, to develop creative new legal forms of collective social control over these data companies. And our indictment and the project as such has actually as aim to trigger that discussion. We want to take that discussion also to the public, of course, because without a public discussion, it's impossible to develop these new kinds of creative forms of property and control over that common good. But we want to also take it to the Human Rights Council of the United Nations, which is the guardian, the multilateral body, which is the guardian of the two international covenants. And because Facebook and the similar data companies pose such a threat to the right of self-determination, which is the mother of all rights in the international covenants, we think it's important to take it also to that multilateral platform and to put that multilateral platform before its responsibility. It has to play a role in this discussion on how to assure respect for the right to self-determination in this data-ruled society. So this is a short introduction to the purpose and the main lines of our indictment, and I hope that in the further discussion we will be able to further work on this and further develop on this.
Thank you so much, Jan. And for all those listening, the full indictment can be found on the website collectivize.org for further study. We're now going to move the procedures towards our 3 expert witnesses, who we have asked the question that Jan just introduced as well, what the future of Facebook under common ownership could or should be if our lawsuits and other lawsuits to follow would succeed. How do we govern Facebook as a collectively owned platform? Do we decentralize servers? Do we ban advertisements? Do we ensure encryption? And how would we undo Facebook's dependency on extractive industries? Or would we need to dismantle the company altogether? In other words, what would be the new social contract for a Facebook under cooperative ownership? We begin with the first act of witnessing the future of a collectivized Facebook with Sonia De Jager. Born in Buenos Aires, De Jager is currently a doctoral researcher at Erasmus University, writing a thesis about the philosophy of artificial intelligence. De Jager also works at the Willem de Kooning Academie as an art theory tutor and runs the yearly music and philosophy conference Regenerative Feedback. Sonia De Jager, you have the floor for 10 minutes.
Hi, thank you. Thanks for inviting me, Thierry, first of all, and also thanks a lot, Jonas and Jan. Very happy to be here. I would like to use my allotted 10 minutes to make a series of remarks. I have full sympathy for the project, so I'll basically be repeating some of the things that I thought were very much worth repeating from the indictment, but then in my own words. First of all, I want to open with a kind of joke. I think it's very telling that in the word processors that I've been using, the word cooperatized has been underlined in red, and the suggestion made instead for a correction was corporatized. I think you see the problem already. So yeah, on the issue of private interest, and of course it's been stated already, Facebook is especially biased in many respects, but it's, of course, never mind the fact that nothing is neutral. The biggest problem with this so-called service provided is that it's not exactly a service, as it's designed to harvest data and sell you stuff on the basis of that data's analysis, of course. So it's similar in a way to an evil scientist's designer opioid, in the sense that it's supposed to be addictive and keep you coming back on the basis of what works best to augment that addiction, right? Of course, this leads us also to the issue of, the illusion of neutrality, like the proverbial frog in a warm bath, which I've heard is not actually true. Like, frogs actually are smarter than that and they jump out. But we blindly allowed ourselves to become dependent on these platforms, and more importantly, somehow we think we are in charge. So, the illusion of neutrality gives us this sense of control, which we in fact, of course, do not have. This, of course, leads to the point of abuse and manipulation. So on this point, you mention forced labor, and a lot of people respond by saying that Facebook pays their users back with the service they provide. And this would be true if it was a service and not this type of monopoly platform that it is. As stated, of course, in the indictment, users can barely escape the platform. I have a lot of friends who say that they use Facebook as a kind of news feed, and that they get everything in one place. I'm not really a Facebook user, but Facebook is filtering what you see as news. It's a very specific, restrictive, manipulative medium between you and the internet, so there is no escaping the manipulation. So who are we kidding in this sense? Like Facebook, Google, etc. are bigger than anything else that came before them, and they cast a network of control over a previously uncaptured territory. And in a way, it's a huge pyramid scheme, right? So both in the sense that a tiny minority control a huge majority, but also in the sense that it keeps spreading, snowballing, leaving lesser and lesser control over to the ones who fall last, and accumulating wealth for the ones on top. So again, the opioid crisis rings a bell here, but even large pharma experience more regulation than these addictive and omnipotent platforms, which is kind of ridiculous. In a way, the power of Facebook over people is nothing new. The church, for example, and similar instruments have acted in comparable ways before, outcasting those non-users into an oblivion of marginality and disconnectedness. Again, to speak of my own experience, I haven't had an account for years. I left Facebook because I disagreed with the way it compromised my behavior. But people still complain to me that they can't get in touch with me because I'm not there. This was especially so in the US, where people primarily just, communicate via Messenger, and they don't basically know how to communicate otherwise. And I've been in the process of trying to get rid of WhatsApp as well, but it's close to impossible that, given friends and family refuse out of ignorance or otherwise to switch to alternatives. It's quite frustrating. I try every day to get them off, but... And I want to close my brief token of support for the project with a movie-inspired image. So imagine that you wake up and you find yourself on the set of Dogville. It's this movie that, there are no walls. You have to imagine the space with the white markings that are on the ground like a flat map. So imagine you wake up there and there is a huge crowd of people outside the perimeter of your house with lasers measuring your moves, microphones listening to the sounds you emit, cables running into appliances all over the house. They're all on the phone, they pace back and forth, hyper agitated like the brokers in the Wolf of Wall Street. Some of them make their way into the house and start doing things like adjusting your arms as you reach for the orange juice in the fridge, and they make you go for the milk instead. They change your newspapers around, they rearrange your books, they move around pictures of your family, they turn your music on and off, they move your head back when you look away from a political pamphlet laying on the doormat, orange clockwork style. Your phone rings and they hang up before you can get to it. You need to use the restroom, but they stop you halfway at the hallway to show you pictures of your ex-wife. I think you get the point. we would never allow this kind of situation in a physical space. So why do we have such defeatist attitudes when it comes to the online world? You know, why do we blindly allow ourselves to become the subject of a profit-driven experiment? So if I still have some minutes, I would like to just answer to, or to paraphrase a few of the questions that that Jonas posed. How do we collectively govern these platforms, not as mere users, but as co-owners? And one of the questions about that was also, do we ban advertisement? And to this question, I would say 1000% yes. And not only on Facebook, but hopefully everywhere. That's quite a long-term project. And on the question of what new social contracts are we to imagine, I think, you know, this is very close to the issue of education and the problem of democracy. And I think that asking users what they want is quite a complicated thing at the moment, unless there is a long process of education that comes before that. So I think a way to start approaching the issue would be for Facebook and other platforms to become, first of all, fully transparent and start a collectively, scientifically based, you know, socially based project of education, showing their users what is exactly happening behind the screens and what could be different to improve the lives of the users and not of the companies. And of course, this would take years. It should be a long project where we all become hyper aware of what's actually happening, instead of, you know, let's say, having a referendum to see what people want right now as change. And I think that would be it. I have a few more things, but I would leave that for the Q&A and the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sonia, and also for this very powerful image taken from the neo-Brechtian cinema of Lars von Trier that instantly makes visible what structural theft on a day-to-day life means once we take away the shiny interfaces that somehow confuse us into the idea that we're being serviced instead of us serving as resources for others. You also made a point in relationship to the business model, the banning of the advertisement. I think it resonates with a point that has been made in the chat by Lexo Zardiashvili, who mentions that that adds or emphasizes the point that the problem might be in the business model first and foremost. If we would own and that the goal should not be to own a company that manipulates us to all get rich. The point he's making is, why not maintain current ownership structure and ban the business model? So he also emphasizes the importance of addressing this targeted advertisement component. Just wanted to add that to the overall testimony. We're moving now to the second act of witnessing the future with Mette Birkedal Bruun, director of the Danish National Research Foundation Center for Privacy Studies, which is dedicated to research into historical notions of privacy and the private. Founded in 2007, the center brings together historians of architecture, law, political ideas, religion, and social conditions, examining how explicit and implicit notions of privacy shape relations between individuals and society. She's also a professor of church history at the University of Copenhagen, where her research focuses on the religious dimensions of the dynamic between withdrawal from the world and engagement with the world. Mette Birkedal Brun, you have the floor of the pre-trial for 10 minutes.
Thank you so much. I want to start by thanking both the organizers and the technicians very much for all their work on this, and I want to thank you for the invitation to join this exciting panel and to reflect on this very important project. I shall raise three overall questions for our discussion, one of them actually picking up the thread from Sonia, and they all concern the human component of Collectivize Facebook. And perhaps I'm more pessimistic when it comes to human beings than the rest of you, but let's see. The first question concerns the human yearning for privacy. The second concerns the human propensity towards greed. And the third question concerns the human capacity for collectivity. So the first question, companies such as Facebook, Amazon, Alphabet, Bayer, Microsoft are the same in that they are trillion-dollar companies that harvest private data that may be and are indeed used to sinister ends. But they are different, these companies are different in that they target different needs. And these are needs that, judging from the success of these companies, seem vital to contemporary human beings. So now I shall ask you to join me on a detour. Here at the CPDP, privacy has generally one meaning related to data protection. But there are other meanings of privacy, and I want you to dwell on them before returning to Collectivize Facebook. This wider meaning of the term privacy is the focus of the research center that I'm heading at the University of Copenhagen that Jonas already talked about. So this is the Danish National Research Foundation Center for Privacy Studies that's dedicated to historical research into notions of privacy in the private. The center brings together historians of architecture, law, political ideas, religion, and social conditions. So at the center, we study privacy as a matter of drawing and protecting boundaries between human beings or groups of human beings and their surroundings. That is, boundaries that are robust or porous, lasting or ephemeral. Privacy, in this broader sense, is important and interesting for our discussion also at this panel because it concerns the relationship between the individual, the group, different collectives, and ultimately society. Exactly like the project Collectivize Facebook. My 3 questions today do indeed touch upon this relationship between individuals, groups, collectives, and societies. At the Center for Privacy Studies, we focus on the period 1500 to 1800, but constantly bring our research into conversation with research into contemporary notions of privacy, including the understanding of privacy as a matter of digital protection, data protection. Thus, I'm coming somewhat from the outside into your project, just as your project is coming somewhat from the outside into the research that we are doing. And this is one more reason to be very grateful for being here today. At the Center for Privacy Studies, we're not so much interested in reaching a definition of privacy. Instead, we want to understand the field of tensions between privacy and the private on the one hand and their opposites. So we are talking about the field of tension between the private and the public, between the private and the professional, between that which is private and that which is common, between that which is private and that which takes place together with others, and finally that which is private and that which is evident. It seems that in the past and in the present, privacy is something valuable that people seek to establish, even in moments or under conditions where it's difficult to obtain. And now we come back to the project. It also seems that one of the things Facebook has been able to offer is the pretension of privacy. And here I'm not talking about data protection, because we all know how ill they fare with regard to data protection, but I'm talking about this wider version of privacy. I'm talking about the sense of privacy that can be established in a closed Facebook group of like-minded. A sense of seclusion, a sense of not being public, common, or together with others. My first question is, how will this yearning for privacy in the wider meaning of the term fare in a collectivized Facebook? Will there still be closed Facebook groups in a collectivized Facebook? My second question concerns human greed. Human beings are greedy. We are driven by greed for money, greed for power, greed for respect or admiration. The problem that Collectivize Facebook is addressing has a lot to do with greed in various forms. There is no indication that the human race is evolving towards less greed. My second question for our discussion is, will a collectivized Facebook have to take measures against greed? And if so, which measures? My third question, and this takes up a thread that Sonia also took up. My third question concerns the collective. History shows that revolutions, and this is a form of revolution, that aim to shift power to the people can end up being fractured by different understandings as to who belongs to the people, or in this case, who belongs to the collective. I have 2 questions. The first is, are there some people who do not belong in this collective of the collectivized Facebook? What about Zuckerberg? The second question concerns our capacity for collectivity. A lot of us have been raised in more or less individualistic cultures. are we even trained for this kind of responsibility? Do we need some kind of education in order to lift it? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mette. I think these were some really essential questions that resonate with some of the comments that are being made in the meantime by Abe Streel. Collectivization does not always deliver the best result for welfare and also self-determination. Or Barbara, who says collective ownership, while in theory a good idea, in practice it will not work. I think these indeed are questions that we should take into the closing panel. And the comments you have made in the beginning, that the pretension of privacy that is being upheld by Facebook is essentially one of its products. I think is very helpful also to fend off the kind of self-reformist attitude with which Facebook is trying to get rid of public critiques. And of course, these tends to be regulation boards that they handpick themselves and will certainly not lead to new forms of ownership. I think this was a really essential comment as well. We will continue now with the third act of Witnessing the Future, and this we will do with Annemie Vanackere, who studied philosophy, theater and film studies in Leuven and Paris, has been the artistic director of the Newport Theater in Ghent, artistic co-director of the Rotterdamse Schouwburg and its international program, and since September 2012 has been the artistic and managing director of Hau Hebel am Ufer Theater in Berlin. It explores the intersection of theater, dance, performance, strong emphasis on engaged theory and discursive events. Her multiple-year program Spy on Me, a yearly festival, explores all of theater, art and culture in relation to surveillance capitalism. And it's important to mention that she has been the commissioner of the Collectivize Facebook project, which was presented in Hau for the first time. So we will close the witnessing acts from artistic and cultural perspective from where the project initiated in the first place. Annemie, the floor of the pre-trial is yours for the next 10 minutes. But you will have to unmute in order to join us.
Oh, the classic. We cannot hear that sentence anymore, do we? I was saying that my internet is a little bit unstable, so I hope I will get through. It's a pleasure to be here. A little bit. I jumped in on a very short notice. I'm impressed by Sonia's and Mette's remarks, so I will be a bit more coming from a bit another perspective. As Jonas said, the Hau has this series of festivals called Spy on Me. Actually, the first edition in 2018 was really concentrating on big data and what this does to our self, our feeling of self, but also what it does to society. And quite pessimistic, I must say. And the second edition, which was supposed to happen, or which happened actually indeed in 2020 in March, but which we had to transport like overnight onto a digital festival because of closing of the theaters from the 11th of March onwards, had a subtitle, which for me is still a very valid logline for the work we do and how it's the artistics for the digital present. And the festival, I felt for myself the need to try to be not only tech pessimists and see in what sense technology can really bring something to the world that makes the world better without all the negative aspects. And so as we are a theater, we also look for artistic maneuvers who are really working with this. And of course, Jonas and me are in touch since many years about his projects, and for me, the way he is using the artistic space or understanding the artistic space as a space for action also, and as a very political space, is hitting the nerve of the way we are organizing our theater in Berlin. It means also that art is we have a strong understanding of public space, right? The public space being actually privatized more and more. If you're on the public space, there's always the cameras. Your data are being collected all the time. And so there's a kind of a reverse movement that entering the theater, you are more in a kind of a public space without all those elements than when you are on the street. So that this was one of this is one of the understandings we had, that the theater as a space where things are possible is pushing us to research more into the way the digitality has infected our lives. So the Spinal Me #2 in March was a very major event for that festival. Was going to be Collectivize Facebook, live on our beautiful Hebel Theater stage. I think you saw the artwork that Jonas made in the beginning. This is built, actually. It's, I don't know how many meters it is, 4 meters high or something, and really huge. So I think also for Jonas and Jan to say goodbye to the live event was painful, because there's a strong belief also in a collectivity of bodies. I think this is something that also the theater can offer, and is I mean, we miss it all dearly, and so the collectivity of bodies, I think, is a very powerful thing to organize oneself. This is not going to happen in Collectivize Facebook. It's an online thing. I think we are all challenged more due to the pandemic to really think of what it means to have a feeling of communality, not being together with our bodies in the same space. So I think we also need technological tools for that somehow, and we are really working also sometimes with artists who use existing tools and then pervert them into something else that we're not meant for. So these are also the artistic maneuvers that I'm talking about. I've been, so this imaginatory space, or the imagination space that Jonas uses also for his political imagination, is for me a very strong and a powerful way of also, I say again, using an art space. I've been following the conference yesterday as a visitor, and I want to quote one young artist. She has also a space, Jonas, in front of our spaces. She's called, where did I write it down? Yasmin Boudiaf, and she says, no tech for tyrants. I think it's just wonderful, right? So it's, why I'm quoting her is, there should be actually not so much power in those private companies. So of course I'm a supporter of the Enlightenment. I can if I may just refer to one of the pre-panel was actually about digital sovereignty, and Mireille Hildebrand made a very brief and very concise explanation of what the difference is between the government and the private sector. And she says, okay, government, we pay them, we pay money, we pay taxes in order for the government to make decisions for us, including how the private sector is organized. Private companies are giving us things. Even if we buy something, they give us things. And you cannot give something to a private company because it would make them that they're obliged to us. And that's the last thing they want. So why I'm saying this is that I think indeed a platform like Facebook we should not be obliged to them. It should be something that maybe I would be willing to pay in order that it gives the services that I need. Right? So this could be something also, what is maybe a membership fee or something, makes me much more powerful, because then I am kind of, I oblige them, right? Mette said, yeah, you are more optimistic. I think what I often quote is I'm a Zwangsoptimistin, as they say in German. I feel as a leader of an important cultural institutions, I have to be, right? It's we have to look for ways of kind of dealing. It's sometimes really very hard. So to the questions, I would like to give in the discussion what Sonia said about the advertisement. I'm also against I would say also 100% against advertisement, but then I think, well, the way advertisement has changed is, okay, so we have the phenomenon of the influencers. They actually advertise themselves, and private companies understand the mechanism, and so this is also a way to subvert advertisement that is not so bluntly with a banner or something. So people advertise themselves. How to deal with that, right? And then there was another remark that I found so interesting in what Mette said, and I cannot find it back, I think. Well, maybe also the way privacy is organized is, I found it very attractive to see what is actually this need of privacy. I think there is maybe a difference in different societies, how they think about privacy. I fully agree that, I mean, in this conference, it's about the kind of me privacy. But there are societies where there's just not, I mean, there's another taking care of what it means to be a private person as part of a society or a community. So I think there's also the need to look into that. And maybe the last remark to the collectivity. I think to have it part of a curriculum of school kids, how to be part of a collective would be fantastic. I think in the Western world, we really need that. I mean, I work with different also in the arts world. I mean, the arts world, especially maybe visual arts world, but also in the theater art world, you have to have kind of an ego to be an artist. Yeah. So on the other hand, in theater is always collaborative. You cannot make theater on your own, and there's a strong tendency for collective groups. There's some wonderful groups that I work with who have equal pay and all. We can learn from that probably to see what it would mean to organize our collective work with Facebook. I leave it to this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Annemie. I think the point you were making earlier, that if Facebook was a service you could pay for, that would recognize you as an actual client, you would even be more comfortable with the platform. It's something that media researcher Siva Vaidyanathan has described in his book Anti-Social Media, in which he says if Facebook has us as clients, that in itself would be revolutionary, instead of considering us as products and resources to be extracted for its own benefit. And your last comments bring us back to some of the key points raised throughout these different testimonies and via various questions in the live chat. Mette summarized it as who is the collective, what defines the collective, is there anyone that falls out of this collective ownership over the future of Facebook, Google, and other trillion-dollar companies? And what about the mentality, how to collectivize in a liberal capitalist society that is based on hyper-individualism, and in which indeed, as Annemie also said, privacy becomes something of a product, an individually owned product rather than a collective right. It's a point that resonates also with a comment by Aida Ponce del Castillo. She said collectivism is a core activity of trade unions. What about including trade unions in this project? They are facing the same struggle and are experts in collective action. Maybe Jan, to start with you in the last 15 minutes that we have for some closing reflection. This narrative, collectivity, a great idea, but impossible, contrary to human nature. How to respond to how would you respond as the lead lawyer on a lawsuit that builds on the trust in the collective?
Well, first of all, I want to say that I'm very happy about the discussion. I'm very impressed by the discussion, because I think this is the kind of discussion we need to go forward. Huh? It's to look into all these different kinds of aspects and to think collectively about these aspects, to try to find ways to take this forward. And so I'm very happy about this kind of exchange, because that's precisely, I think, what it's all about, what the project is about. It's triggering this kind of discussion. Now, let me try to very, very shortly say something about the remark of Mette, who said, yeah, this is like a revolution. Maybe I'm exaggerating a little bit, but she says this kind of revolution is actually somehow against human nature. The greed stands in the way of this kind of revolution, the lack of training of the individualism triggered by, and I think all that is true. All that is, of course, completely true. But I would like to say this: before the revolutions that could put an end to the absolute regimes, before the revolutions that created actually the society in which we are living now, the French Revolution in particular, of course, people were not trained to exercise democratic rights at all. And even worse, it seemed totally utopic and unthinkable to create the societies which we are living in now. That was, for 1,000 years, it had been the other way. And then somehow collective debate in society, but also the necessities of the evolution of society made that at some point what seemed completely impossible became reality. And so I think we're in that kind of process. We're in that kind of process, or we should be in it. We can't actually continue with a society where the concentration of economic and therefore also political and social power and cultural power continues with this concentration of that power in very few hands continues, and where people are actually deprived increasingly from their right to self-determination. That is, I think, a development which, at least in the long term, is completely contrary to the basic interests of the vast majority of the people of the world. And so I'm quite sure, like absolute monarchies were in contradiction with the basic needs and rights of people. And so I think we simply have to try to trigger that discussion. We simply have to try to contribute to taking things forward, because at some point the present situation will be completely untenable. I also think that we have to learn from those revolutions, because you're right that this is also a kind of need for a revolutionary development. I think we also have to learn from those revolutions that realizing these rights and establishing these rights is also a process, because the French Revolution, of course, says égalité, liberté, but equality, of course, was not realized by the French Revolution. And of course, the society that came out of this is not a society where equality is fully realized. And so there also, I think we have to learn from that gradually establishing a collectivized control over these basic instruments, these so important instruments for our right to self-determination, will be a process. We very, very modestly want to contribute to that discussion and to that process by launching this project.
Jan, let me, sorry to interrupt, because we're running in the last 10 minutes. I think you're making some really essential concluding remarks in relationship to the questions that Mette has provoked into this panel. But I want to take a last 10 minutes to return also to Sonia. When this question is asked, who is the collective? What is this need? Is there enough of a belief in collectivity to realize it? How would you respond to these questions? Maybe also from your research into artificial intelligence. Should we also expand the idea of what is a collective and who belongs to it, other than the human user?
I think the question of AI is too big to answer in these last couple of minutes, so I will maybe try to make a small remark at the end. But to answer to the question of the collective, well, I mean, first, the first relationship would be that we are already creating this very potentially dangerous thing by this sort of strange sense of collectivity or non-sense of collectivity that we have right now. So that's already something that, you know, that should be stopped as soon as possible. But in the sense of collectivity, I think, you know, the platforms we're talking about and the discussion on advertising sort of has emerged out of the issue of being online and being sold things against your will, etc. But I think it's nice that just the conversation about advertising in general is arising, because Facebook, Google, etc. They took the biggest poison from, you know, the huge amount of knowledge that emerged out of the advertising techniques of the 20th century, and they you know, they ramped it up, like you be yourself, be original, be individual, go you know, go your way, blah blah blah, and indeed creating this thing that Mette and Annemie already spoke to, like we're hyper individualized. So I think one of the things as a possible alternative that a lot of governments could start implementing would be to replace a lot of advertisement, also on the streets, etc., with education, for people to be bombarded with stuff that is actually useful for them, and not, you know, the bullshit that we are supposed to consume. So that would be one thing that would be very interesting. Like, how do we create this collective? Well, first start informing people about what a collective could be, what it could look like, instead of brainwashing them with the idea that they need to be original, individual, and go their own way, which is basically what we all are, you know, constantly fed wherever we look. And also that we're not good enough. So like the ideal is that to which you should aspire, but you're not good enough. You'll never get there. It's like a carrot in front of your face. So that's pretty horrible, and that would be one strategy I would implement. You know, replace advertisement for education would be amazing.
Does that relate, Annemie, to the point that you were making about the space of the theater? Is what Sonia is mentioning now, what Mette mentioned, the need to educate in collectivity? Do you see the theater as such a space?
I was shortly out, so I'm afraid I will not maybe answer to it precisely, but in your question, I would say yes. I see there's an emancipatory power in participating in culture and art in general, I think. And of course, I have a specific preference for particular art forms, but yes, I think I had to think of. I have another quotation from a panel from yesterday from Amba Kak. She said, "We keep on talking about fixing technology, but what we need to do is fixing society." And I think all these matters actually come back to the question on how do we make use of this technology, and then education is quite major, I would say. Yeah.
To return to the instigator of many of these questions, Mette, you kind of summarized, you made a testimony in the form of questions that really put the essence to the table. What is the collective, who belongs to it, and are we able to enact it in a liberal capitalist society? How do you what are your final thoughts to the testimonies to your testimony?
Only that I agree in the need for education of us and among us.
Can I add education with fun? I think it should be fun. I mean, this is something that probably in talking about this, it's sometimes there's great word in German, Spaß befreit. So there's no fun, and I think it would be great to try to make there's a sparkle, yeah, that are energized by it somehow.
I think this is also a part of the role that these pre-trials have to lay out, as Jan has did with great precision, a legal argumentation, a concrete pathway of collective action, and at the same time take the space to speculate and engage with the joy it would mean to collectively offer massive infrastructures of extraction again. Jan, I want to come back to you for your last thoughts on the social contract, the alternative social contract that has been assembled here, and then we will close this panel.
Well, I think actually the collective already exists. The collective already exists in practice because the collective is all of us using and working together in the social media. The question, I think, is we are not consciousness. There's no consciousness about the existence of the collective. And that is something we really have to work on. Then that could, I think that consciousness is absolutely necessary to be able to come to a new social contract, to be able to come to a situation where we collectively not only act as a collective, which we are doing already, but where we also use that collective action as an instrument to actually take control of our lives collectively and individually. And I think the new social contract, you can only conclude a contract if you're conscious about the fact that you are engaging in a contract. And I think that is very important matter, and where education and public collective discussion and art, as in all previous revolutionary situations, comes in. So I think that is what Collectivize Facebook is about.
Thank you, Jan. I think that these are beautiful concluding remarks. Thank you to Sonia, to Mette, to Annemie for contributing to this first speculative social contract of a future collectivized Facebook. A last remark in the chat comes from Victoria. We are missing other side's arguments. It was indeed proposed to have representatives of Facebook in this panel. I refused that because I have no interest in providing them additional platform for their PR, heavily paid PR stunts. But we will certainly come in court at the UN Council of Human Rights, where they will bring all the lawyers that money can buy. Imagination and collective imagination, that is one thing that they have not yet been able to purchase, and that is the power with which we are trying to bring this case forward, that you can join at collectivize.org. Thank you so much, everyone, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you for having us. Bye-bye.